Hello, everyone, and welcome into this, the 16th episode of the Horse Racing Show. I'm Kenny Rice. Well, we have nothing to talk about this week. We'll see you again next week. Now, you might have heard the Kentucky Derby was run over the weekend at Churchill Downs. You might have heard that Maximum Security finished first, but was then disqualified by the stewards, upholding the objections of Flavien Prat, who was the jockey of the horse named the winner, Country House, who had finished second. And wow, what a snowball effect it has had, not just in horse racing, but horse racing is still being talked about in the general population, which usually doesn't happen even in a well-run derby where you have a nice winner. Oh, great, that horse won the race. Let's move on. Instead, people are still talking about it because most don't understand. An objection is what the jockey can file. An inquiry is what the stewards can file. The stewards, the three judges that set up and look at the race, and they see an infraction. In this case, it was the jockeys, two of them actually, Long Range Toddy with John Court, and Prat, as I mentioned, who was the winning jockey, as it turned out, on Country House. If you look back at the video, and NBC did just a usual great job. Rob Hyland produces it, Drew Esikoff directs it, and you can see how he was the subject of causing interference, Maximum Security. He moved out a couple of paths into the path, especially of War of Will, Mark Cassie's horse. He got the worst of it. If there's one horse that has a complaint, one connection of a horse that has a complaint, it's War of Will. He was by far affected the most. Long Range Toddy, that was John Court's horse, also affected in that. Bodie Express, the long shot, he was affected in that. Who wasn't really affected, although he says he moved out just a little bit more, was Country House. And that's where it gets confusing. The stewards did follow the letter of the law. They did. When there's interference, you're supposed to take the winner down or move him down a position or two or wherever they deem fit. But it's always been kind of a wink and a nod in the Kentucky Derby, an unwritten rule between the trainers and the jockeys that this is going to be a rough race. There's a great chance the best horse does not win. And as we've seen over the years, with a few exceptions, and Justify and American Pharaoh are the two, the best horse doesn't always win. It's the best horse on that day. We can go back and name a litany of horses that have won the Kentucky Derby. You never heard from them again. I mean, they didn't win another race in their career. I don't know if that'll be the case with Country House, who ran a surprisingly good race, by the way, at 65-1. But my take on it is, it's politically correctness to the extreme. If what had not happened at Santa Anita with the tragic deaths of these horses this year, and with the emphasis on horse safety, which has always been there, by the way, let's face it, if you own a horse, you want the horse healthy. You don't want to hurt the horse. If you run the racetrack, you want the horse healthy. You want healthy horses running out there so people will come and bet and spend money on drinking and eating and paying parking and buying racing forms and programs. So everybody's always interested in the health of the horse. It's like, are you against cancer? Are you against heart disease? Well, yeah. I mean, who's saying I don't want a healthy horse out there? Now, what this leads to, though, is because there was some danger there. I mean, it could have been a disastrous snowball effect had Maximum Security moved over just a little bit more and cut off War of Will more. Who knows what would have happened? So the stewards followed the letter of the law. I have no complaint with what they did. It's just a little unusual that would happen in the Derby given a rough race. Probably other years that would not have happened, but because of Santa Anita and because it's so much now about horse safety all the time, that's why it happened. In my opinion. That's why I have my own show. And that's why I have Thomas Kenny, our expert researcher, here with us. What do you think about that analogy, Thomas? You buying any of that stuff?
I think it's pretty good, yeah. I have to wonder, because I'm a fan of motorsport.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's also a steward's room in motorsport.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times what you'll see, people will get penalties as a matter of time rather than of position.
Right.
Say you cut a corner or you bump somebody wide and overtake them when you shouldn't have.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you'll get slapped with, a second penalty, 2-second penalty, whatever the stewards deem fit. But in a 2-minute horse race, a penalty, even as much as a second, that could cost you 10 positions.
Yeah, exactly.
So, the casual observer might say, well, why not just give maximum security a penalty.
Right.
Well, if you give him a 2-second penalty for cutting off War of Will, that still might knock him down just as much as the stewards decided to position-wise.
17th, that'd be about right.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at the final chart, like you say, I mean, there's not a whole lot of difference in the first 5-6 finishers, and a length is considered a fifth of a second. 1 second would be 5 lengths. That's kind of the general rule in horse racing. 1 second, 5 lengths. 2 seconds, you're 10 lengths behind.
That's a massive gap.
That really is. Then you start getting like into, if you got into that 10th position, you'd be down there around like win and Cutting Humor or somebody like that. You'd be dropping way down. As it did, they moved him all the way down. Totally out of the money, totally out of the top 5, which does pay off 1 through 5. What I think, though, is going to be interesting in this, like in car racing, it's mostly about the stewards, isn't it? I mean, the drivers, do they file a lot of objections themselves? I guess they can complain like a jockey can, right?
Yes.
So that's similar.
If there was an overtake where contact was made and a driver feels that they were wronged in that instance, then they could file a complaint the same way a jockey would.
What I think this is going to open up, and Scott Hall, back on lead guitar, is always with us.
Yes, sir.
Tell me what you think about this.
I tell you, I agree with you, Kenny. But ever since our interview with Mott at Churchill, I was all about Country House. So I'm cashing a ticket on him, and I think if anything I say will be, I'll choose to say nothing further other than I agree with you. I think Santa Anita was a factor, but it worked out well in my favor, this race.
Oh, well, I have one question, my friend. How long have we known each other? Like 20-some years?
Yeah.
Did you think to call me and say, hey, that game winner pick is way off, Kenny. How about going with Country House? Did you one time think about a text? I mean, just a brief text where I could have looked at it, and that's okay. Don't worry.
The
it's
second
okay.
I did it, we would have had a different outcome.
Did you get a text, Thomas?
I didn't have a horse in the race.
I mean, not even from, did Scott send you anything and say, go bet Country House?
No.
Thanks, Scott.
Hey, no problem, kid.
Okay. I forgot what I was going to say. We need to have a script on this show, don't we? No, I know what I was going to say. What is going to happen, I believe now, because this is unprecedented, now that the precedent has been set, there was that unwritten rule, maybe a little too macho, that I'm not going to complain. Kind of like a little bit of car racing, guys. We swap some paint out there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to complain too much because I'm manly and you're manly, and we ain't going to complain. Jockeys didn't complain, trainers didn't complain, but that's a whole new era.
What do they say? Rubbin's racing?
Rubbin's racing. And that was kind of like it with horse racing. Bob Baffert said as much. He's been one of the few people to come out and the most prominent to come out, other than obviously Gary and Mary West, who own the horse, Maximum Security, and basically say as much, that you put on your big boy pants and you went out and you didn't file an objection. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that's what Bob Baffert said. And a lot of people will agree with that. And I agree in the sense that the Derby is not like another race. When I interviewed Bill Mott, he likened it to the middle of the week, a race, a $10,000 claiming race, which probably would have maybe 8-9 horses in it. Certainly much different than a higher caliber race with 19 horses, sometimes 20. To me, it's like the basketball game where you get to add another person onto the court. It's the football game where now you got 12 on 12 or 13 on 13. Do you call it differently? I don't know about that, but I think that what it is, Thomas, is going to open up. And Scott, jump in. Tell me what you think. Down the road, I think there'll be more objections in future derbies, and maybe this year's Preakness and maybe the Belmont, because you get paid 1 through 5. Mm-hmm. So, there's some money on the line. You may not be the guy that's going to win it, but I might be the guy that could have gotten 3rd, and that's a lot more money than if I finish 6th. Yep. I get no money at 6th and 7th. So
yeah, there might be a lot of 6th place horses, 6th place jockeys who come out and say, "Hey, he bumped me into the rail.
Yeah,
I want my piece of the pie now." Right?
Yeah, I think so. Don't you think so, Scott? That this is opening up. We might see it next week in the Preakness. I don't know.
Yeah, attention's on it now. So I think you're right. When everybody's focused on that now, the chances are you get a lot of people calling. I think you're correct. I think this changed things in a way.
Gary and Mary West, they filed an appeal with the State Racing Commission. The State Racing Commission said, no, we're not even going to hear it. And I understand that, and I think they knew that as well. The Racing Commission is going to take up for their own people. And their own people made a gutsy call. I don't want to downplay that. I've known Barbara Borden a long time. She's the chief steward, and she takes it seriously, always very serious, very cautious. They didn't make any kind of random decision up there. Someone put a clock on it. It was 21 minutes and 57 seconds. So the greatest 2 minutes in sport come down to the slowest 21 minutes, 57 seconds in sport history, in my opinion.
I agree.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you stay awake watching that, Thomas? Did you think we were going to get through that day?
I was waiting with bated breath.
Bated breath. Okay. That's a good way to wait. Later on, we'll have a history lesson to wrap up the show, talking about something that happened all the way back in 1968.
That's right.
That went on for years.
5 years to be exact.
5 years to decide the Kentucky Derby. But that was because of a drug test, and that was after the fact, after everybody had left, and they didn't even know. This year, people knew. I guarantee 75,000, that's probably conservative, of the 150,000 at the track left there confused. Maximum Security was the best horse. Nobody's doubting that. But he did interfere. He did break the code. He broke the law.
You got to play by the rules.
So that was it. Larry Collmus, the great race caller, the man that called it the Kentucky Derby for NBC, calls the Triple Crown. He'll join us next. Later on, columnist for the Lexington Herald Leader, Mark Story, with a great take on why is the Derby this year so different than last year or other years in judging it. And the intrepid reporter for the Washington Post, Chuck Culpepper, will join us. He covers about every sport possible. He was covering the Derby. I'd like to get his take on just what he thinks about that. All that coming up. Larry Collmus is next. Stay with us. You are watching and listening to, what are you on?
iTunes,
Thank
Google
you.
Play. That's where the podcast is. We're also on YouTube, of course. That's where you get the video.
93.9 Louisville radio.
The Ville.
Okay, so we're on all those. So thank you. Whatever you're watching or listening to, this is the Horse Racing Show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Horse Racing Show. Glad that you're with us. Lots, of course, to talk about with this year's Kentucky Derby. More than any Derby I can remember or probably ever will. And the man that called it is the voice of the Triple Crown and the Breeders' Cup on NBC, the voice of New York racing, and just the voice. Nobody better calling a race than my friend Larry Collmus. Larry, welcome into the Horse Racing Show.
Well, thanks for having me, Kenny. I've heard so many great things about this show, and I'm just happy to be on with you.
Well, thank you. You know, we try to have fun, try to have the personalities on, and let people know a little bit about those in the business like you, and, you know, talk about some of the topics of the day. Wonder what's the topic of the day, of the week? Probably the topic all the way till we get through the Preakness, huh?
I guess so. Yeah, it seems like a couple of people have mentioned the Kentucky Derby to me since Saturday, and wasn't a horse disqualified or something?
You know, is that amazing? As you were sitting up there, I'm down there with Bill Mott. You're up there watching the booth. I read this, it was 21 minutes and 57 seconds. So I guess that gave someone something to do, is to put a clock on this. Did you have any idea? Because about the 15-minute mark, I'm not saying I knew it was 15 minutes, but, you know, it was a long time. You're figuring in your head. I kind of thought something's going on here. I wasn't sure it was going to stand up. And at first I thought there's no way they'll have a DQ of the winner in the Derby. And after about 15 minutes, I thought, well, hold on, something is different here.
Well, I'll have to tell you about my personal experience. I was up where I call the race, which is actually just a couple of doors from the stewards who were making this decision. And I admittedly said, you know what, this probably won't take too long, you know, because inquiries take, 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to head downstairs and make sure I, get my ride out of there with everybody, because it takes me a while to get down from the seventh floor. So I made my way all the way down to the first level and over to where our NBC compound is, and went into the trailer where we hang out before the Derby.
Right.
And it's just me and Dale Earnhardt Jr. and the stewards have still not decided what they're going to do yet. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. This is still happening. So here I am explaining, what's going on with the steward's inquiry, and an objection to Dale Earnhardt Jr. I did not expect that to be the end of my day at Churchill Downs. And then they took the horse down, and I'm like, did this just happen? Did they disqualify the winner of the Kentucky Derby? This is unbelievable.
It is, and I've had people make, I think, good points on both sides. First off, there was interference. I'm not going to debate that. And the steward's call, they followed the letter of the law, in my opinion.
I agree. I think they made the right call, Kenny. Honestly, after watching it, originally I thought there's no way you take down the Derby winner, but then I watched it from the different angles that you get to see it. And by the way, I really get a kick out of the people that tweet to me that, how dare you not mention this interference in your live race call? I'm like, it's not that simple. It's the angle where that happened. You don't see that live around the 5/16 pole. That's the toughest part of the track to see from my perspective. And there's no way I'm going to be able to, call that while it's happening. But, after seeing it a few times and from the high on top shot and the different angles, I think they made the right call in the long run. I think they probably could have done a little better job communicating what they were doing and what they were looking at, because, all that I saw was that Flavien Prat on Country House was claiming foul against Maximum Security, and he wasn't really bothered at all, but several other horses were.
Yeah, that was the thing I thought. And honestly, as I'm watching it, I'm standing out in the paddock with Bob Baffert and watching the race. And when you come in, I'm like you. Most people, I guarantee, did not pick up on that. They might have seen a little bit watching the camera. They might have seen just a little bit. You could tell that, I couldn't tell exactly how many of the horses were affected. You could see a little bit of pull up, I thought, in War of Will. I was kind of keeping an eye on him. I thought he had a shot at getting up in the top 3 or 4. But no, I couldn't have said, wow, look at that interference there. I thought he might have checked a little bit. But, I'm listening to your call. I'm watching it. I'm kind of keeping an eye on Baffert. And I think most people, until after the fact, had a chance to look back at the great coverage of NBC. And that's not because we work for them. I thought it was terrific the way everything was handled. But, yeah, I mean, it's not a spur of the moment. You take 19 horses out there, folks. Take 19 anything and try to remember the name of it. And what Larry Collmus does is etched in stone. Everything the rest of us say is vapor. For years, that call will be replayed, and then they'll tell about what really happened after the race, not what happened during the race. It's not your job.
Yeah, sometimes you can see interference. If it happens right in front of you, the horses are coming, to the 16th pole, and 2 horses bump, and you see one veer in front of the other. That's one thing. You can pick up on that, but not 19 horses in the mud as they're turning for home in the Kentucky Derby. There's just too many things going on. The one thing I did see was when Bodie Express took up and started to drop back really quickly, and you don't realize at the time that it's because he was interfered with. You think, well, he's an 80-1 maiden. He just had enough,
Right.
But he was part of that mix that was bothered by Maximum Security's duck out there, and it unfortunately happened. The stewards, in my opinion, made the right decision, and we move on from there.
The one thing it's curious about this for me, and I read an article by my friend Mark Story, the Lexington Herald Leader, who did pose this question, which I think is a good question. What's changed? And I think he based a lot of that on what Bob Baffert said earlier this week, where Baffert said, in essence, I'm paraphrasing here, that you just don't come out with an objection at the Kentucky Derby. You can expect it's going to be a rough race. My horses have been compromised in the past. He's not talking about this Derby, but other Derbies, and that's just the way it goes. It's not like any other race because of all the horses that are out there. Is that fair at all to ask that question, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there has been some sort of an unwritten rule that sort of everything goes in the Kentucky Derby because there's so many horses. The jockeys don't want to be the ones, claiming foul. I think also you have to think with the events of the year and the things that went on out in California, that horse safety is becoming, a huge priority. I mean, it always has been, but it's something that I think everybody's extra cautious about. And did that come into, the play of the steward's decision that, the horses were put in an unsafe, position by Maximum Security coming out? Maybe, and that could be what's changed, but it's hard to say. I mean, there was interference for sure.
watching Larry work, as I've had the privilege of doing for several years. I've known you, I don't know how long we've known each other, 20, 25 years? Something like that. And we've worked together since 2011 at NBC. I believe it's 2011, right?
It is. That was my first year when Animal Kingdom won the Kentucky Derby.
And he wasn't supposed to win that, right? I thought he was a grass horse. I never did understand that. That's what I've loved about how much the game has changed with training. In the past, you just write horses off. I would, at least, if they didn't have X number of starts in their 3-year-old year and things, just going back in the last 15 years or more to see. And if a horse laid off like a Barbaro comes in 6 weeks after Florida, no way he's going to win. That's what's really been interesting to me, how much the game has changed in the training methods and just the routes that some of these horses have taken to the Derby.
Yeah, there are different ways to get there, and Animal Kingdom's way was Turfway Park, and
yeah.
it worked, that on the synthetic track that day, and all of a sudden he shows up and just blows everybody's doors off coming on the outside in the Derby.
What amazed me about Larry, he's thoroughly prepared, and you got your iPad and you're looking over all the silks, and I mean, I just wonder, how do you call a 19-horse or 20-horse field that you only have to do one time a year? And that's always the Derby, and that's the race that more people are going to watch than any other race. So how many hours does it take to prepare for that, Larry?
Well, in an average horse race, let's say it's a 10-race card at Belmont Park, and you've got a half an hour between races. Well, generally you're going to look at those horses, a couple of times before they come onto the track as far as what the silks are going to be. And then when they come onto the track, you'll look at them for 2 minutes or so until you feel like you know who they are. For the Kentucky Derby, I started in like February.
Yeah.
You start watching prep races and reviewing them over and over and seeing these different horses, not only their running styles, but what they look like. You try to get a head start on that. And then as you come up to the last week or so, the kind folks at Churchill Downs will send me the cutouts of all the jockey silks, and I'll make flashcards. I'll put the jockey silks on one side, the horse name and any other information that I think is pertinent, running styles, who the trainer and jockey are, and I'll put that on the other side. And I'll quiz myself in the last week leading up to the Derby, maybe 10 times a day. Until I realize my brain is tired and I have to stop, because then it just defeats itself. But it's a process that just goes on and on until the horses actually come onto the track and they play my old Kentucky home. And when that happens, that is the greatest opportunity to see the horses, because they're right in front of you, and you just start your brain again and making sure you know who all 19 or 20 of them are until you're comfortable, and then you let them break out of the starting gate, and there you go for the next 2 minutes. Your legs are shaking, your binoculars are trying to be steady, your palms are sweaty, your heart rate goes up to 200, and they hit the wire, and it's all over.
Just like that. That's it.
Yeah.
That's how you become the best racetrack caller. Okay, that's it. You want to be a great race announcer, you want to be the best, just do what Larry Collmus just told you to do right there. That's it.
And try to get your heart rate from 200 to about 170, and maybe that'll help a little bit.
Oh.
It seems to want to be up closer to 200.
I imagine, because you don't allow yourself to think how many people are tuning in, do you? I mean, you can't think of how many people are watching, much less listening, at the track.
Believe me, you try not to.
Yeah. I try not to.
Kenny, the one thing is like the nerves generally are worse leading up to the race than when they're actually running the race, because you get into your own element during the running of the race, where this is what you do. Your brain has been doing this for 30, 40 years, following a bunch of horses around the track, and you're telling people what's going on. So during that time, the nerves are still there, but they do tend to lessen a little bit while the race is running, because you're kind of just doing what you always do, except for the 18 million people part, paying attention to what you're doing. So, and most people are screaming and yelling anyway, so they're not listening. And the call of the race is more for later than for the actual time when the race is going on. I think more people listen to it later than they would when it's actually running because they're cheering for their horses.
And not to add any more pressure to it, but the words of Larry Collmus live on and on. The rest of us, maybe we make a misspeak or a stumble along the way. We get that corrected. You don't remember any of my reports on Bob Baffert. My reports on no Louisville trainer had won a Kentucky Derby. Still haven't, by the way. But you remember what Larry says as they come down the stretch. Well, I just added, did I add more pressure going into the Preakness, Larry? Sorry, my friend.
After dealing with the fog of last year's Preakness, I think I'll be okay.
Well, that's why I was going to ask. Last year's Preakness, to me, of all your calls, including finally the one, which I thought was just perfect when American Pharaoh won the Triple Crown, by the way. I just thought that was the perfect, so succinct, dead on. But last year in the fog, and I'm on the backside, and I'm looking at the fog rolling in. It looked like the John Carpenter movie. I thought Adrian Barbeau was going to step out at any moment. It was crazy fog out there. And how in the world you called that? Because if you were right on the track, I mean, and I was standing on the track next to Bob Baffert, I couldn't see it. I couldn't see half the race. I mean, even on the monitor, I'm looking up and I'm losing it. I don't know how you did that. That's still to me, your most remarkable call, given the circumstance.
Well, thank you. And there's an interesting little backstory that happened earlier in that week at the Preakness. They were getting the infield set up with all the stuff that's in there, and we realized that there were all these extra concert stages that blocked views of that I had on the backstretch. There was a good, I don't know, eighth of a mile on the backstretch that was completely blocked because I call races through binoculars.
Right.
And I couldn't see that area. If it was, maybe 50 yards or so, well, they get through there quick enough that it doesn't bother you. But this is a full eighth of a mile. So normally I don't have this, but the NBC guys put two high-def monitors right in front of me. And as it turns out, I needed them to call almost the entire race because I couldn't see anything. There was no way I was going to be able to see through my binoculars. They don't see through fog. They're not quite that good. Maybe a little, $10,000 pair or something can see through fog, but I don't know if that exists. But anyway, I give full credit to the cameraman from NBC and to the guy that directed the show, Pierre Moussa, who was the man that did all the switches to the camera shots. And, it was perfect because there was one time on the far turn where they were maybe a 16th of a mile where they just didn't have anything. And I just sort of took my time, and instead of saying, they ran 3/4 in 1:11.23, I said, they have run 3/4 of a mile in 1 minute 11.23 seconds as they round the far turn in the fog at Pimlico, and then they appeared again. So there was a little bit of time where I had to kill, and then after that it was pretty much okay. So those guys did a great job of giving me enough shots to call from, and they get the credit. I told Pierre, I said, you called the race because I wouldn't have been able to see it anyway.
That's what a pro does. Just a little bit more. There's, and just another extra word or two. You're still telling the story. You're letting it move along. And that's what you've been doing since you were 18 years old. I believe you called your first race, you told me before.
Yeah, I was 18. I had been practicing calling races through a tape recorder at the Maryland tracks. They had found a place for me up in the press box at all the different Maryland tracks. The fellow that used to run the press box, Eddie McMullen, was kind enough to find me a little spot, and I would kind of work for him as a gopher. And when the time came one day, Chick Lang Sr., who was the general manager of Pimlico, heard me practicing race calling up in the top level at Pimlico in a little room, and he came down, and his son was the publicity director, and he said, who's that kid up there? He says, that's Larry, wants to be a race caller. And he said, well, let's get him started at Bowie. He can call one a day over the microphone. And that's how it all started. And I remember the first race I called, won by Tiara's Flame, trained by King Leatherberry and ridden by Alberto Delgado.
Wow.
And I was 18 years old, and was backup announcer for 2 years, and then got my first full-time job with Chick Lang Jr. at the Birmingham Turf Club in Alabama, where I was. My claim to fame there was calling the first ever career win of then just plain Donna Barton, who is now Donna Barton Brothers.
Yeah.
So, we go back a long way too. We were both 20 years old at the time.
And do you ever get nervous? If you do, I've never seen it. I've certainly never heard it, but being around you before big races, I've never seen it.
I do. Of course I do. Especially when I get up into my perch for the Derby. I think that is the most nervous you ever are. And it does not go away. I mean, this was the 9th Kentucky Derby. And honestly, I think I was more on edge for this Derby than I have been in previous ones. And I think it had to do with the wide openness of the race, the mud again for the 3rd straight year. And I don't know, there was just many factors that get you a little bit on edge, but I try to keep calm and keep laughing, and try to ease the tension as much as you can in the lead up.
And what I liked, you picked up Country House 65-1. You were right on top of it. Because a lot of people, let's face it, he's 65-1. Who's going to be looking for Country House coming down the lane? There's not many people that are just sitting up there in the stands. They're going to say, "Hey, there's Country House."
Well, luckily there were only a couple of horses with yellow colors, so that helped him. And Bodie Express were the only two. So Bodie Express had a red cap, so it was easy to discern the two of those and go from there. So they weren't too muddy when they turned for home, which helped, but there were a lot of them that were still in contention. And honestly, when the rail opened and Code of Honor blasted on through on the inside, I thought he was home free and headed to victory, and all of a sudden Maximum Security's back in front. It made for a very interesting stretch duel.
On the NBC telecast, perhaps you saw Larry did a great feature on horses' names, going to the Jockey Club and the horses' names and the names they've thrown out there that, well, you certainly have to enunciate some of those names, don't you?
You do, and you have to be careful sometimes too, because some of these guys will get you to, call a horse where if you say the name wrong, it's going to not be a very good thing. I think the one that Tom Durkin always had to deal with was one of my favorites, the horse named Shiny City Shoes. And that was the famous Caesar Kimmel, the horse owner who would purposely do that. Right. And he was also the guy that had flat feet. And horses like that. Now the latest one I had to deal with was a horse that, if you look at the name, it doesn't seem like it's a big deal at all. But then after you have to say Irish wristwatch, and if you have to say it 3 times fast, you're going to be saying I was with what. It's difficult to enunciate that one. So sometimes, you just have to be kind of careful. Make sure you say the right thing.
You've called so many. This is I don't know. It's like interviews. I've done a lot. Certainly the stage you've been on and called some of the great races in the last couple of decades. Do you have a favorite or a favorite or two calls of yours that you look back on and go, that was a heck of a call I just made. That was a fun race. I enjoyed it. I'm really proud of that.
Well, I think you can only judge your race calls by what you get to call. And I mean, there's just nothing in the world that will ever compare. And I don't think, in my career, there's no way anything can surpass American Pharoah winning the Triple Crown. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact that it was, we had all waited 37 years for this to happen since affirmed, and you're up in the booth at Belmont Park calling, the Belmont, not just for NBC, but for the first time for NYRA. That was my first year as the track announcer at Belmont Park, and poor Tom Durkin had gone 24 years calling races there, never got to call a Triple Crown. And then, you step up there and history occurs, and you're the incredibly lucky guy that gets to narrate it. And the fact that, American Pharoah won by 5.5 lengths enabled me to, give a definitive, exciting, dramatic call to what and say what I wanted to say. And it was a moment that, just could never be topped. I mean, Justify last year was calling another Triple Crown was incredible. It was fantastic, but it wasn't American Pharoah after 37 years.
Right.
And I don't think anything ever will be again. And the other one that was almost there too was actually American Pharoah again winning the Breeders' Cup Classic and going out a winner like he did. And that was just a complete thrill. And I was just overwhelmed with excitement and joy after both of those races.
Finally, the one, we get him on the show, my friend and the great race caller, Larry Collmus. I really appreciate your time, Larry, and I will see you next week in Baltimore.
Can't wait, Kenny. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
All right, we'll have you on again later on this year. Larry Collmus, it's as good as it gets. That's what we try to do here each week. Stay with us. There's more of the Horse Racing Show coming up. Welcome back to the Horse Racing Show. This guy's a friend of mine. He's a terrific writer, columnist for the Lexington Herald Leader, Mark Story, who has written has given one of the best takes, I think, on the whole Derby disqualification. And rather than read it all to you, I thought the man himself should be on here to talk about it. Mark, welcome into the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Kenny.
I thought that you posed a question that I don't know if anybody else has really posed, and that is, what's different?
Well, if you look at how the Derby has traditionally been officiated, it's in basketball terms, they've sort of let them play. I mean, people when you enter a 20-horse field, you know it's going to be, kind of a rough, rugged ride. And most years you come out of the Derby, somebody has a story of, their trip was impeded by contact. And, usually there's no ramifications for that from the officials. And obviously this year there was a rather major ramification. And I wish the stewards would have talked or, beyond issuing the statement they issued and taking questions and sort of answered, why they, felt this year was different than the way the Derby has traditionally been sort of refereed, so to speak.
Do you think it's just gotten to the fact that, and I mentioned this earlier at the start of this show, I think politically correct to me has gotten skewed. It was fun when it started out. You're supposed to try to be nice to each other, try to get along with each other, respect each other. I get that part. But now we're so sensitive, and since I feel if Santa Anita hadn't happened, we might not have a disqualification. That's just my opinion on things, because obviously the nature of the safety of the horse is paramount more than ever before.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think either consciously or subconsciously, the situation at Santa Anita and 23 horse deaths, I think that played a major role in what happened at the Derby. I think the irony in that, at least to me, is, had they let the results stand to the larger sports population, the millions of sort of general fans that, watch the Derby and probably don't pay that much attention to horse racing the rest of the time, they would have all moved on. Mm-hmm. Kind of by the fact that they disqualified, and we were seeing all these frame by frame replays of the race for days on end. It sort of emphasizes just how dangerous it looks. Yeah. So while I'm sure they were trying to do the right thing, I think they may have unintentionally brought more scrutiny on the sport rather than sort of taking it away.
That's an interesting point. We had Larry Collmus on, the man who calls the Derby. And, he was talking about that people have been, and you know how this goes with social media, Mark, they've been tweeting him. Why didn't you mention when they were turning there that there was an infraction, in the race call? And I've had people, did you see how bad it was? Well, no, I did not. I think you just summed it up. I would guess that 98% of the people there did not pick up immediately how profound it was when you see it in slow motion and you see that War Will almost runs right over as he's moved in front of by maximum security. But you don't see that as it's happening. Very few people see that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I didn't get the sense as the race was run that there was a lot of feeling in the immediate aftermath that, it had been a controversial trip. it was the replays that obviously brought that to light.
Do you think that in horse racing that this has any impact at all on a national audience? They're always looking for that. What's going to get people interested in horse racing? 2 Triple Crown winners. It did something for the moment, but it hasn't made it rocket past many sports as far as popularity. I'm not sure that controversy helps that much either, but I don't know. What do you think?
I don't think it will have a positive impact long term. If the same 2 horses were going to run back in the Preakness, I think it might create interest for that rematch. Since it appears that's not going to happen, I would guess the Preakness TV ratings are going to be pretty. No offense, Kenny. I hope everybody tunes in to watch you, but I would guess they're not going to be robust.
I think the same thing, and. A friend asked me the other day, think of this scenario. Said, what if Country House is just so much better than those 65-1 odds and everybody missed on him and he goes on to win the Preakness and the Belmont? Would he be the Triple Crown winner, really?
That's an interesting question. I was doing some research on 1968, which obviously is the only other time a Derby winner was disqualified in a very different, not on the track scenario. But the horse that was awarded the Derby victory, Forward Pass, then went on and won the Preakness.
Yes.
And there was a lot of, in the media commentary at the time, there was a lot of debate about if he wins the Belmont, is he really a Triple Crown winner since he didn't win the Derby on the track? If Country House wins the Preakness, I think officially he's going for the Triple Crown, but I don't think the public would see him as a legitimate Triple Crown winner.
No, I don't either. I wish, and not that the West family's worried about what I think, but just from, in some ways, almost sort of for ratings, but really almost in a public relations move. It'd be interesting, wouldn't it, if they say, we've changed our mind. They're not going to hear our appeal. We're going to run our horse again and show that he's the best. Now, that's the kind of drama and controversy that everybody likes in any sport, I think.
Yeah, I think if both those horses come to Baltimore, then the Preakness becomes super interesting and commands a big national platform. And under that scenario, I think the controversy would bring people in. But if that rematch does not occur, then I think the controversy in the long term is going to hurt the sport, not help it.
Talking with Mark Story, columnist for the Lexington Herald Leader. Of course, in Kentucky, we know him well and read him all the time. You can read him online wherever you are. Go to Kentucky.com. Mark, one thing that I think might happen out of all this is because, as you astutely pointed out in your article about this, and as Bob Baffert mentioned about, you put your big boy pants on and basically you just never filed an objection in the Derby. That has been kind of the unwritten code among all trainers and jockeys over the years. But now with this precedent, I just wonder down the road if this is going to become almost an annual occurrence, maybe not so much for the winner, but the fact that it pays down to the 5th position. You may have people filing that, I could have been 3rd. I could have gotten a piece of the pie at least, and you could have been 4th. I mean, I just have this scenario in my head that I should get used to interviewing a lot of jockeys and trainers about why they filed an objection after races in future derbies.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. And the other thing is, if they're going to stay at 20 horses, you're almost guaranteeing by the nature of the event that there's going to be contact and, controversial elements of the race. And you're right, if it becomes kind of accepted practice, which after this, the fact that it paid off so handsomely, I would think it will be accepted practice. I think there's going to be a lot of controversy in future races.
Someone asked me again, I've done some radio shows, and most of them are sports shows where people really don't talk about horse racing except briefly around Derby time, and honestly wouldn't be talking about the Derby had the disqualification not happened. So I understand that. And on one show they said, so I guess this is like a foul in the first 3 minutes of the game should also be the same foul that should be called in the final 10 seconds to decide the game. I said, yeah, I mean, as far as the infraction, it was. And I know if this were the average 8-9 horse field in the middle of the week, it would have been called automatically. Nobody would have thought about anything. I said, but if you want to stay with the basketball analogy, the Kentucky Derby is like going into the NCAA championship game, except now you're playing 6-on-6. So you got 2 extra guys out there. Do you call the same fouls that you would call as a 5-on-5 game? I mean, the Derby, like you said, it's its own entity, and it's and there's nothing else to compare to it. in horse racing. I mean, as far as just the number of horses that are going to be running in that one day.
Yeah, it's a genuinely unique event, and it had always been officiated in that way. And that, I think, is the question the stewards needed to answer Saturday night. And somebody in the chain of command in Kentucky horse racing in the state probably needs to still answer that. Is just, why was it officiated differently this year? Did they believe the infraction was so egregious that it outstripped all the prior years, that it merited kind of a departure from how the race had always been called? I think that's a question that really needs to be answered.
And, I think everybody's still worried about litigation and what else. Forget about appeals right now, that they're going to be silent for a while. That's just my guess. I have no inside information, but I just wonder when somebody will come out and address this.
Yeah, that's a good point. And as long as there's the threat of litigation, there probably isn't going to be a lot of information forthcoming, and that's too bad, because that's just going to sort of let the uncertainty and, I don't know, ill will or whatever controversy is going to linger, I think, for a while.
Well, you should read him each day, as I do, and no matter where you are listening in around the country, go to Kentucky.com. He is Mark Story, the columnist for the Lexington Herald Leader. He always makes you think, and this week especially with the question, what's different? It's always been a rough run race. It's always had a big field, and there's never been a DQ like this until now. Mark, I really appreciate you being on with us.
I appreciate you having me, Kenny.
All right, thank you. Stay with us. More coming up on the Horse Racing Show right after this. Welcome back to the Horse Racing Show. Thank you for watching and liking us on YouTube and following us on Google Play and all the other places that we're on out there. And, of course, you can go to @Horse Racing Show or @Kenny Rice Sports on Twitter. With me is a longtime friend of mine. He is as good as it gets. He is not just, I don't call him a sports writer. He's a writer that covers sports. He covers human nature, human beings. He is the intrepid reporter, columnist for the Washington Post. He is Chuck Culpepper. Chuck, welcome into the show.
Thanks for having me, Kenny. Thank you so much.
Well, the thing with us, we catch up, every 5-6 years, and we kind of pick up the conversation. That's what's comfortable with us.
Maybe in an airport gate or something, or, happen to run into each other, or a horse track.
Well, as we did recently at the Kentucky Derby. And if you follow Chuck on Twitter, I like it. Nomad, sports writer, Washington Post, Residence Earth. I like the way you sum it up.
Is that what it says?
I don't know. That's what it said a minute ago on your Twitter. I don't know. Have you changed it? Because
no.
you are a citizen of the world. I think you moved to New York finally, but my goodness, every time I see Chuck, he's covering some event all over the world. He was in Louisville, Kentucky last week. So let me start with that. What is your impression on this? And with all the sports you cover, and I don't think there's one you haven't covered, what's your impression with the way that the Kentucky Derby played out, as far as your readers are going to be able to try to grasp, and the general sports world is going to try to understand how suddenly there's a disqualification in a race that annually has a lot of horses in it and usually is a fairly rough run race for somebody?
Well, it's never anytime you're at an event where something happens which has never happened before, you're kind of you're mapless, you're kind of in this lost terrain. I know I made a big mistake on Saturday, but I was just, my brain was just moving around in ways that it doesn't normally. It was so hard to process the whole thing. I think one thing it's told us about the huge amount of traffic that's gone to it on our site, on our website, and about sort of people in general, and the fact that there's much more interest in this than there normally is, even in a derby, is that people are obsessed with refereeing. I think that, sometimes you go to a basketball game, you sit there and we get to sit at courtside, which don't take for granted, but, you sit there and you hear somebody, and the only reason he's at the game is to analyze the refs the whole time. And that seems to me there's more and more such people. I'm not sure. And sometimes I sit there and I wonder, why do you even go? This is such an exercise in misery for you. And so I think that's the Derby now has kind of played into that. I think maybe when people are dealing with referees, it's when they feel powerless, maybe the most powerless. It's like, I so desperately want my team to win, and here's a person who's sort of in control of whether that happens to a large degree in some cases, so, and people will talk about calls forever if they didn't go the way they think they should have gone. So I think that's what this Derby has done, is played into that general area of human nature where and stewards are referees. They're up on the 6th floor, but they're still referees in this particular endeavor. So I think that's what's come into play here, and that's why there's so much interest, including among news editors and everything.
And with transparency, that is such to me, a throwaway word anymore. We hear politicians all the time. Every transparency, as we know in real life, there's few things that are transparent, few things that people are really going to open up about. I don't care the situation. In this, with the stewards, they did issue a statement. Now, I will say this: NBC always has a camera in the stewards' room. We meet with the stewards on a regular basis before the Derby. We're well prepared. Barbara Borden, the chief steward, she was there again this year. So with all that covered, they had the opportunity to talk to the NBC people because they knew the cameras were there. They agreed on that. They knew a microphone was there if they wanted to give an explanation, not a debate, not a Q&A, but say, this is why we made the call. They issued a statement and didn't take any questions at the press conference. Chuck, in your opinion, with all the other sports you cover and getting back to the officials in other sports, do you think there's needed to be more said than just the statement about the interference as to why maximum security was taken down?
Yes, I do, and I think it would have helped them. I think it would have helped clarify some of this sort of speculation about why they themselves issued no inquiry and why it relied only upon the 2 jockeys. And maybe I've seen some talk about maybe that's because the jockeys' calls came soon enough that they didn't. But that doesn't seem to quite make sense to me. But maybe it does. It could. So, but I think it really could have helped them in several areas there. Obviously it would have helped the public, but I think it would have helped them also to have somebody to sort of field the questions and explain some of the things that were left unexplained after the race. If you think about other sports, though, they did handle it the same way, as other sports did. We never see a referee like from the Rams-Saints NFL game of last January or from, say, the Auburn-Virginia Final Four game. We never see those people kind of brought to the press conference room and then, ask questions. And that's seen as kind of part of the way the sport works, and maybe even healthy for the public that these refs sort of stay in the background and that they issue statements, as happened at Churchill Downs, only to a pool reporter, which is one reporter who's assigned in case there's commentary needed from referees, but they don't go to a press conference and they don't answer questions. So it did work on Saturday the same way that it does in all the other sports we follow. So there's that to consider too.
We're talking with Chuck Culpepper, the Washington Post, one of the great writers out there who also covers sports. Do you like that? By the way? Because I think when they say sports writer, they think, oh, there's the fun guy. Kind of like with sports guy. Oh, there's the guy having the fun, yucking it up. I don't know. The toy department.
I'm a person who cannot handle compliments of any kind. So.
Okay.
But thank you.
No more pudding for you, Chuck Culpepper. Yeah. As far as covering horse racing compared to some of the other sports, I mean, just the whole atmosphere like of a Derby, and you covered Wimbledon, you covered World Cup. I don't know what you honestly haven't covered. Super Bowls, Final Fours, World Series, all that in there. Is there any kind of thing that connects them all, that kind of weaves into that fabric of sports in general, or is that too broad a statement?
I remember going to a Derby in the 90s. I'm not quite sure which year it was. And the trainer of one of the horses was a woman who had grown up in Japan. And she had been in Tokyo when the bombings were going on during World War II. And here she was training a horse in the 90s in the Derby in the U.S. She had long since moved to the U.S., I think. And she told these stories about how, she had taught herself English in the basement while she could hear the bombs outside. And I remember thinking at that time, the difference between this sport and most of the other sports largely is that a lot of times in horse racing, the people, the characters we're writing about are older.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Baffert's 66, Shug McGaughey's 68, Bill Mott 65. So they've already lived these lives,
Mm-hmm.
and also these lives in a hard game. So they have these viewpoints that are often kind of richer than those, in other sports where you're dealing, with a 40-year-old basketball coach or something like that, which nothing against a 40-year-old basketball coach,
Right.
but, they just have a lot of times when they're willing, more to say, more experience. That to me kind of separates this. And while other sports, can have, coaches of an old age, it's Jim Boeheim is in his 70s, doesn't look it at all, but, they have, other sports can have coaches like that. Horse racing just seems to have more of it. And then, you factor in the idea, another thing that differentiates it is that we don't get to hear from the athletes, just as Richard Mandela was saying last week.
Right.
We don't get to talk to our athletes. So there's that mystery about it, which actually in turn usually becomes one of its appeals.
And what I like about your writing and all the good sports writers out there, when I talk about writers in sports, when I separate it like that myself, probably covering sports for as long as I have, I do like the people stories. I mean, there's some obvious things. Tiger Woods is a great golfer. I got that. I don't follow golf a lot. I watched intently, though, the Masters this year because of all the backstory. We know all the things he's been through. That's just one example. I love it when a writer like yourself brings out personalities and brings out situations that are far from the obvious. That guy's a good hitter. He's got a great jump shot. These are things that I kind of already know. I like to know more than that, and that's what I really like about your work. And that's kind of what drew me to horse racing is there's several layers to a horse, from jockey to trainer to owner to breeder.
Yeah, that draws me to it as well. And when in the beginning, when I started doing it in the early 90s, I just was, floored by that, by how many people there were involved, because I had not been around it. I'd always watched the Triple Crown on TV and so on. But you can suddenly be following the story of a horse and run across, say, one year it was a breeder who remembers being in Germany when the U.S. finally marched in, and he remembers, he was telling me all about how sort of the victims, he was telling me how he didn't want history to kind of broad brush or erase what he saw when he came in, because it was real and it was awful.
Right.
So, that kind of thing, in horse racing, because there are so many connections, you can really start, there's just such a lot of people's stories within it. And often in sports, we have a hard time getting to those, and it's a person's personal choice of whether they want to share it or not. But so if a person does want to share it, that's when you can really maybe gain some understanding that goes well beyond the sport, that helps you then understand aspects of the sport as well.
Chuck, when you show up at an event, no matter what the sport is, do you go in with some idea of what you're looking for, or you just kind of roam the grounds a little bit, the stadiums, whatever, and kind of start picking things up and go from there with your stories? Because it always interests me how you come up with these stories that are off the beaten path and so captivating.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. I usually have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 ideas in mind from just reading up, that I'm going to maybe pursue. But then I always like to use this phrase, listen for the huh. It's kind of your HUH, your own huh. If something makes you go, huh, then maybe you ought to pursue that. I was at the Olympics one time in Athens in 2004, and this 14-year-old diver from Malaysia got up on the board on the platform and at the diving competition. I thought 14, and he was this so little. And he was born in 2000, the first athlete I ever remember being born within this century. And I didn't follow it, and I regretted it later. I kind of, because he wasn't going to win.
Right.
But I kind of thought, you should have pursued that. I regretted that later. And so the Olympics last year in 2018, I was at a cross-country skiing event where the closing finishers, the last finishers, were maybe 36 minutes or so behind, a long time behind the winner, but they were all coming. I mean, they were staggering in and collapsing onto the snow. And a lot of them were from countries that don't have a lot of skiing history, but they went and trained in countries that did, countries like Colombia and the guy from Tonga, who we all knew about, and
right.
so on. And just to talk to them after and what they felt and everything was one of the great experiences of my life. So, I love that idea that you can be at something and then run across something else that you go, whoa, that's really something. So that's kind of how it works.
How many passports have you gone through? Because I don't know of anyone who's been to more countries than you.
Well, they make you get a new one when you run out of pages.
I know.
For the stamps. And if you show up at the airport without an available stamp area,
yes,
without any available space, you can't go.
I know that. That's why I ask how many.
Yeah.
Right? You got to have gone, 3, 4? I mean, seriously.
I think it's 4.
Yeah.
They and one time I went to the United States Embassy in Abu Dhabi when I used to live there for 2 years, and they put 24 new pages in the middle. I think they stopped doing that, but that was a nice thing for a while. So I had one that went through 2 iterations, first as a thin thing and then as a 24-page thicker one. So that used to be, I don't think that's available anymore, as I understand it.
Not even for you? Not even for Chuck Culpepper, the Washington Post columnist? Jeez.
I only do a few columns. I'm mostly a staff writer. So,
well, when you're out there covering, do you have like this? Getting back to this Derby, do you think this is going to have? Do you think, in my opinion, we were talking about this earlier with some guests. I'm all for political correctness. I'm all for people treating each other as people should, regardless of anything else. I mean, I think to me that's the essence of it all. Sometimes I think it gets off on a track where it gets a little too much. Where it gets a little extreme. I'm not sure horse racing hasn't experienced a little bit of this in the Kentucky Derby for what happened at Santa Anita. Had, for example, the tragedies of those deaths at Santa Anita not happened and not been so reported and covered by people outside of the horse racing media, and the emphasis on safety, which has always been there but now paramount. In other words, I'm not sure in that long-winded statement of mine that they would have taken this horse down in any given Derby year because you kind of expect a Derby to be a rough-run race. I'm not saying that they didn't follow the letter of the law, but it's a little like, when certain places say, okay, we're going to give you 70 miles an hour, but if you go over 76, we're going to write you up. We may give you 81 next week, but this week it's 76.
Right. Right.
Does that make sense to you at all?
I had not yet given thought to that. You mean that Santa Anita could have entered the thinking of the stewards?
So much is made on horse safety. And obviously, when you look back in the super slow motion on the NBC cameras and you see the front legs of War of Will now suddenly going under the back legs of the, at that moment, winner maximum security as he comes over a couple of into the path of War of Will. And thank God, for just a second there, if they clip heels and somebody goes down, the domino effect could have affected 3 or 4 horses or more. So I understand that. When you look at that, truly, there was some danger there. It wasn't reckless on the part of Zayas, the jockey. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying at that moment he let his horse drift enough, it could have caused something. Most derbies, I believe they would have probably let that go. This derby, because of Santa Anita and because we've heard so much talk since Santa Anita about horse safety, regulating medicine, should they use whips, all these things surrounding the track conditions at Santa Anita, that maybe that factored in. I mean, I think it's plausible that they thought, we're going to show you that we're not going to let anybody drift into paths in a crowded field because of the horse safety. Maybe they wouldn't have a year ago. It's just my guess.
I'm wondering, has something like that, I mean, we know it's happened all around the track during the Kentucky Derby. But as Bill Mott was pointing out, the stage of the race at which it happened might have been unique, and because the two horses he really affected then had, maybe any chance to win was then ceased at that point.
Mm-hmm. I
know some people are saying, well, they wouldn't have won anyway, which I guess is fair if you can figure that out, but it just struck me as kind of more basic. Just that he occluded two horses. He kept them from whatever chance they might have had. And so we'll put him behind the horses that he affected. And that was that. That was the only thing I saw there. I don't know. Maybe they have an entire, this is another question that they could have fielded that night that would have helped everybody, I think.
Yeah, no, that would make sense too. Will you be going on to the Preakness, or is it back now on the road to more sports, more countries, or will you stay closer to home than do the Preakness next week?
Well, I will not be doing the Preakness, but I will be staying on because the Derby is never going to end. The 145th Kentucky Derby.
That's why I figured you might actually be covering the Preakness, is only because of what happened at the Derby.
I think it's possible. Usually I'm based in New York. Usually we send people who are based right around Baltimore and Washington there. So I guess it's possible they would ask me to do that if it were related to the Derby. But what I do have to move on to is back to what is the topic you brought up, Tiger Woods, because the PGA Championship has moved from August to May, and it's next week on Long Island at Bethpage Black course. So Tiger won the U.S. Open there in 2002, so we'll see what happens with this.
Yeah, I think I might stay there. Wonder what we'll be talking about all next week at the Preakness. Wonder what we'll be talking about in Baltimore, Chuck, for the next 6-7 days leading up to the race.
I know. Wonder what.
It's so glad to catch up with you. I hope we can do this again.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was so great to see you the other day.
It was great to catch up with you. I'm always a fan of your work and always fascinating. If you follow Chuck on Twitter, it's just, where it's like, where's Waldo? I mean, where's Chuck Culpepper this week? Because I'm just stunned that you're staying in the U.S. for now, like a stretch of like 3 or 4 weeks.
I'd like to go see the Cricket World Cup in England and Wales, but I think the chances might be low on that one.
If you do, please call and explain it to me. Honestly, most sports I figure out. The cricket is the one sport I still don't get. I can follow any sport. If I can watch one sport at least once, maybe twice, I got it. I get the idea of it. I still don't get cricket, and I've tried to watch it.
I've sat through. I went to India for the final in 2011, and I wasn't in the stadium, but I was outside watching with fans, and I just, I tried to follow. But India won. I know that. So because the streets were amazing. So anyway.
Yeah, that's what I learned. Always bet India in the cricket matches.
Well, they do a lot of betting there. So.
Chuck, thanks again, my friend. We'll catch up again soon, I hope.
All right. Thank you so much, Kenny.
The intrepid reporter from the Washington Post. Always read him when you can. Chuck Culpepper. And we'll be back to wrap things up here on the Horse Racing Show right after this. Welcome back to the Horse Racing Show, episode 16. Going like that, isn't it?
It just flies by.
It's a great
show.
So
much to talk about on this show.
And today, the Derby, I don't know, maybe we cleared it up, give you more to think about. Larry Collmus, thank you. The great race caller, Mark Story from the Lexington Herald Leader, their columnist that really has some astute observations about all this year's Derby. Chuck Culpepper, a great reporter for the Washington Post. He covers the globe with sports. If you read him on a regular basis, you know that. With his take just in general on should the stewards have talked, should they not have, is more expected of them than any other sport. I have said that the stewards maybe, they should do what they did, just issue a statement. We don't hear from the NFL. We don't hear from the NCAA. They don't have to talk. I don't know if horse racing needs to be that much different. Possibly it needs to clear it up a little more, given though it was the scope that is the Kentucky Derby. But in 1968, nobody knew what social media was. No 24-hour news cycles. You had 3 stations. You got that or you didn't get anything. And there was a horse that won the Derby, and people left there thinking he won the Derby. But lo and behold, by Tuesday of that week, he did not win the Derby. And that was Dancer's Image, who was disqualified, and Forward Task was named the winner. Thomas, you have been delving into the history books.
That's right. There were even headlines that came out that said, among other things, Dancer's Image wins the Derby commandingly.
Yeah.
And then, Baltimore Orioles beat the Braves by however much. But yeah, it was pretty much a done deal at that point. Dancer's Image was the winner. Forward Pass came in second, and that was, enough said. But at the time, it was, part of regulation that they would drug test the winning horse of the Derby and then another random horse out of the field. Mm-hmm. And so when they drug tested Dancer's Image, it came back positive for a drug called phenylbutazone, which is a drug used in training. It's been likened to like an aspirin sort of medication for horses. And Dancer's Image had problems with ankles during training. So they decided to, give him phenylbutazone to alleviate that. And while it is an acceptable drug for training, it wasn't allowed at the time for use on race day.
Yeah, now nobody would care.
Right.
But then in 68, it was a big deal.
Yeah, it was a banned substance in 1968.
And so he is taken down, as they say in the sport. That sounds just cruel, doesn't it? Just like maximum security we've talked about. He was taken down. That means in the old days, the number was taken down. When they'd post the number on the board, like in this case, number 7, they'd take his number down if there was a inquiry or objection that was held.
That's right.
They'd either hang it on the board in the old days, or then, they'd put it up electronically a little later on, but the number then would go down. That's why they say taken down, by the way. There's a number. So they took his number down. He's not there. Asterisk all over the place, rewriting history at that time, and Forward Pass is the champ.
Mm-hmm. Peter Fuller, the owner of Dancer's Image, obviously was incredibly upset by the decision and filed for appeals for 5 years. Originally, his first appeal was won, but then, you keep going to higher and higher jurisdictions, and, at the end of the day, he lost his case. Peter Fuller was seen as an outsider among, the Kentucky horse racing community.
Right.
He was a New England guy, Harvard educated, a car salesman.
Yeah.
Didn't really fit in with the rest of the crowd, right?
Right.
And he often felt that he was discriminated against because of that.
Yeah.
Who am I to say whether or not that was true? Only time will tell.
And what's interesting about this year, Gary and Mary West are well-respected, well-known. They've been great for horse racing. They have had horses for many, many years. This was for about 21 minutes and 57 seconds. They were the Derby winners with their horse for the first time ever. They were the winners with maximum security. They will not let their appeal didn't even make it to the front door, as I knew it wouldn't, of the Kentucky Racing Commission, because a couple of things. When you have a trainer's license or an owner's license, whatever state you're in, you abide by the rules of that state. And in this state, in the state of Kentucky, it says, hey, the steward's decision is final. That's it. We don't review it. We don't appeal it here. Probably will go to court of some kind. I hope 4 years from now we're not talking about this, but we might be. I mean, it is the one race that everybody wants to win, the Kentucky Derby, and the West had it won briefly, but there was an infraction. The stewards made the right call. Maybe in the past years, without the emphasis on horse safety so much as it is now, maybe that call would have not been made. I don't know. But that's just not to say it wasn't the right call. I guess we'll do the Preakness next, won't we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Speaking of the Preakness,
yes,
Dancer's Image went on to race in the Preakness after being taken down from his win of the Kentucky Derby. Forward Pass ended up winning that Preakness, of course, but Dancer's Image placed third and was disqualified again from that Preakness for bumping off other horses.
Whoa. There is the footnote to history, Thomas Kenny. That's good. 0 for 2.
Right.
0 for 2 in the DQs. I wish Maximum Security, in a perfect world, he runs in the Preakness. They're not going to run him, it looks like. I wish they would run him. I wish there'd be a rematch. It'd be great for TV. It'd be great for horse racing, I think.
It would make for a wonderful story.
Scott Hall would bet once again.
On Country House.
Okay, yeah. So see, it doesn't matter. Yeah. That's it. All right. Again, thank you for being with us. We look forward to episode 17 coming up. We'll preview the Preakness and see if anything else has happened on the Kentucky Derby road. Until then, I'm Kenny Rice. Thanks for watching and listening.